Mrs. Evelyn Johnson, Hannah's voice carried to every corner of the room, is our mother. The silence that followed was deafening. You could have heard a pin drop in that courtroom as every person tried to process what they'd just heard. Two white lawyers, clearly from privileged backgrounds, claiming a black woman convicted of murder as their mother? Whitman's mouth fell open. Judge Sterling's gavel slipped from her fingers and clattered onto her desk. In the defendant's chair, Evelyn finally looked up, tears streaming down her face as she saw her girls, her babies, standing there in their robes and wigs, ready to fight for her life. "She saved us when no one else would," Grace added, her voice breaking slightly with emotion. "She loved us when the world had thrown us away. And now it's our turn to save her." The courtroom erupted into chaos. Reporters shouting questions, spectators gasping and whispering, Whitman frantically shuffling through his papers, as if looking for some way to object to love itself. But how had it come to this moment? How had two distinguished white barristers in traditional robes and powdered wigs come to stand in a packed courthouse, declaring their love for a black woman facing execution? 30 minutes earlier. "Your Honor, this woman is a cold-blooded killer who deserves to die for what she's done." District Attorney Charles Whitman's voice had boomed through the packed courtroom. His finger pointed accusingly at the frail black woman sitting in handcuffs at the defendant's table. Evelyn Johnson had kept her head bowed, her graying hair falling like a curtain around her weathered face, as if she could hide from the hatred radiating from every corner of the room. She manipulated a vulnerable elderly man, gained his trust, and then brutally murdered him for his money, Whitman had continued, his perfectly pressed suit and slick-back hair making him look like he'd stepped out of a political campaign poster. "The evidence is clear, the jury has spoken, and justice demands." Objection! The voice had cut through the courtroom like a blade, sharp and commanding. Every head had turned toward the back of the room where two figures stood in the doorway. Young women in traditional black barrister robes, their powdered wigs pristine white against the dark wood paneling, their faces set with determination that seemed to electrify the air. Judge Victoria Sterling's gavel had frozen midair, her stern expression shifting to confusion. "Excuse me? This is a sentencing hearing, not a trial. Who are you, and what is the meaning of this interruption?" The two women had walked down the center aisle in perfect synchronization, their robes flowing behind them like wings. The courtroom had fallen into stunned silence. Even the court reporter's fingers had stopped moving across her machine. These weren't the overworked public defenders everyone expected. These were polished, expensive lawyers who looked like they belonged in the Supreme Court, not defending a convicted murderer in a small-town courthouse. "Your Honor," the taller of the two women had said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from years of winning impossible cases. "We are Hannah Morrison and Grace Morrison, barristers admitted to practice before this court. We are here to represent Mrs. Evelyn Johnson in her appeal." Whitman's face had flushed red. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. The defendant already has representation, and the time for appeals has not expired," Grace had interrupted, pulling out a thick folder of documents. "We have new evidence that will prove Mrs. Johnson's innocence beyond any shadow of doubt." The murmur that had rippled through the courtroom was like thunder before a storm. Reporters had scrambled for their phones, spectators had leaned forward in their seats, and even the bailiff had looked uncertain about what to do next. Judge Sterling had banged her gavel hard. "Order! Order in this court!" Her cold blue eyes had fixed on the two women. "Counselors, while I appreciate your enthusiasm, this court has already—" "Your Honor," Hannah had said, stepping forward with the quiet confidence of someone who had never lost a case that mattered. "Before you make any final decisions about Mrs. Johnson's fate, there's something this court needs to know. Something that changes everything." She had turned to face the packed courtroom, her young face serious but unafraid. Grace had moved to stand beside her, and together they had looked like warriors preparing for the battle of their lives. And that's when Hannah had spoken the words that would change everything. "Back to the present moment. Now, as chaos reigned in the courtroom and the impossible truth hung in the air like electricity, Hannah and Grace stood protectively in front of the woman who had given them everything. The shocked faces of spectators, the frantic scribbling of reporters, the stunned silence of court officials. None of it mattered. What mattered was the tears streaming down Evelyn's face as she looked at her daughters. Two abandoned little girls she'd found behind a dumpster 19 years ago, now grown into brilliant lawyers willing to risk everything to save her life. In that moment, as the reality of their declaration settled over the courtroom like a thunderclap, one thing became crystal clear. This wasn't just about proving innocence anymore. This was about family. This was about justice. And this was about to become the most shocking legal battle this small town had ever seen. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, like this video, and leave a comment letting me know where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more powerful stories, and trust me, you won't want to miss them. Let's continue. The chaos in the courtroom felt like a distant memory as Hannah and Grace sat in the small kitchen on Maple Street that night, their formal robes replaced with old sweaters, their wigs set carefully on the counter like crowns waiting to be worn into battle again. Evelyn moved slowly around the kitchen, her hands shaking slightly as she poured 3 cups of tea, the same ritual she'd performed thousands of times when her girls were young and needed comfort after a hard day at school. "Mama," Grace said softly, using the name that had come so naturally 19 years ago, "you don't have to wait on us. Sit down, please." But Evelyn shook her head, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth despite everything. "Baby girl, I've been taking care of you too since you were knee-high to a grasshopper. I'm not about to stop now." Hannah watched her adoptive mother with the same analytical eyes that had made her one of the most sought-after criminal defense attorneys in the state. Even now, facing execution, Evelyn's first instinct was to nurture, to give, to love. It was the same instinct that had saved 2 abandoned little girls all those years ago. "Tell us again what happened that night," Hannah said gently, pulling out a legal pad. "Every detail, no matter how small." Evelyn finally sat down, her weathered hands wrapped around her teacup like it was an anchor. "I was working the night shift at the grocery store, same as always. Mr. Peterson," her voice caught slightly. "He'd been feeling poorly that week. Had that terrible cough, you remember? I'd been bringing him soup, checking on him when I could." Grace nodded, remembering the elderly white man who'd become like a grandfather to them. He'd taught them chess on his front porch, helped them with their math homework, and never once made them feel different or unwelcome in a neighborhood where they were often the only black family. That Tuesday night, I worked from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. Stocked shelves, cleaned, did inventory with Janet and Miguel. They both told the police they were with me the whole time. Evelyn's voice grew frustrated. "But that prosecutor, he made it sound like we were all lying, like we'd planned it together." "Charles Whitman," Hannah said, the name tasting bitter in her mouth. She'd researched him extensively over the past month. Ambitious, ruthless, with political aspirations that required high-profile convictions. "He's running for Attorney General next year. He needed a win. And I was convenient," Evelyn said quietly. "A black woman living next door to a white man who died with money missing from his house. Never mind that Mr. Peterson had been giving me that money for weeks to help with your college expenses, Grace. Never mind that he'd written it all down in his journal. The journal that mysteriously disappeared before the trial." Grace felt the familiar fire building in her chest, the same righteous anger that had driven her to become a prosecutor herself before switching to defense work. "We're going to find that journal, Mama, and we're going to make Whitman pay for what he's done to you." The kitchen fell quiet except for the ticking of the old clock on the wall. The same clock that had counted down the minutes of their childhood, marking homework time and bedtime stories and lazy Sunday mornings when Evelyn would make pancakes shaped like hearts. "You know," Evelyn said, her voice soft with memory, "I never thought I'd be a mother. Marcus and we tried for years, but—" She shrugged, the old pain still there but dulled by time. "Then I found you 2 behind that dumpster, looking like little angels who'd fallen from heaven, and I knew. I knew you were meant to be mine. Hannah reached across the table and took her mother's hand. We were the lucky ones, Mama. You saved us. No, baby, Evelyn said, squeezing back. You saved me. After Marcus died, I was just existing, going through the motions. But you too, you gave me purpose again. You gave me joy. Grace wiped away a tear, remembering those early days when Evelyn would work double shifts just to buy them school supplies, when she'd stay up all night helping them with projects, when she'd sacrifice everything to make sure they had opportunities she'd never had. The neighbors talked, Evelyn continued. Said it wasn't right, a black woman raising white children. Said you'd be better off in foster care with your own kind. Her voice hardened slightly. But I didn't care what they said. You were my daughters, and that was that. And look how we turned out, Hannah said with a small smile. Top of our law school classes, successful careers, and stubborn enough to take on the entire justice system if we have to. Speaking of which, Grace said, pulling out her own legal pad, we need to talk strategy. The appeals process is complicated, but we have some advantages. The original trial had several procedural errors. The evidence was purely circumstantial, and now we have resources the public defender didn't have. Hannah nodded. I've already put my entire firm on this case. We're going to investigate every angle, interview every witness, and turn over every stone until we find the truth. And I've reached out to some contacts at the FBI, Grace added. If there's corruption involved, and I believe there is, we're going to expose it. Evelyn looked at her daughters with a mixture of pride and worry. Girls, I don't want you risking your careers for me. You've worked so hard to get where you are. Mama, Grace interrupted, her voice firm. You risked everything for us when we were 5 years old and had nothing to offer you but trouble and heartache. You think we're going to abandon you now? Besides, Hannah added with a slight grin, we're really good at what we do. Whitman has no idea what's about to hit him. Outside, the first hints of dawn were creeping across the sky, painting the kitchen in soft golden light. It was the same light that had illuminated countless mornings in this house. Mornings filled with laughter and homework and the quiet contentment of a family that had chosen each other against all odds. But this morning was different. This morning, they were preparing for war. The courthouse steps were swarming with reporters when Hannah and Grace arrived the next morning, their black robes pristine despite the chaos surrounding them. Camera flashes exploded like fireworks as they made their way through the crowd, their faces set with professional calm, even as questions were shouted from every direction. Ms. Morrison, is it true you're defending your adoptive mother? How long have you known about Mrs. Johnson's case? Are you doing this for publicity? Grace paused at the top of the steps, her hand on the courthouse door. For a moment, Hannah thought she might actually respond to the media circus. But instead, Grace simply straightened her wig and walked inside with the dignity their mother had taught them. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity, with people standing along the walls and spilling into the hallway. Hannah had seen high-profile cases before, but this felt different, electric with tension and curiosity about the two white lawyers defending a black woman they called mother. District Attorney Charles Whitman was already at his table, surrounded by a team of assistants and looking like a man who'd spent the night preparing for the fight of his political life. When he saw Hannah and Grace enter, his lips curved into what might have been called a smile if it had contained any warmth. Well, well, he said loudly enough for the gallery to hear, if it isn't the Morrison sisters. I have to admit, this is quite the publicity stunt you've pulled. Very creative. Hannah felt Grace tense beside her, but she kept her own voice level. Good morning, Mr. Whitman. We're here to represent our client, nothing more. Your client, Whitman repeated, his voice dripping with condescension. Tell me, counselors, how exactly does a convicted murderer become mother to two successful white lawyers? Did she adopt you before or after she developed her taste for killing elderly men? The courtroom erupted in murmurs, and Hannah saw several reporters frantically scribbling notes. This was exactly what Whitman wanted. to turn their family into a spectacle, to make their love for Evelyn seem suspicious or calculated. "Mr. Whitman," Grace said, her voice carrying the kind of steel that had made her legendary in courtrooms across the state. "If you have questions about our client's case, we'll be happy to address them through proper legal channels. If you're simply here to make inflammatory statements for the cameras, perhaps you should consider a career change to tabloid journalism." A few people in the gallery actually chuckled, and Whitman's face flushed red. "How dare you? All rise." Judge Victoria Sterling entered the courtroom like a storm cloud, her black robes billowing behind her, her expression suggesting she was already tired of the circus her courtroom had become. She was a woman in her 60s with steel-gray hair pulled back severely and eyes that had seen every kind of legal maneuvering imaginable. "Be seated," she said curtly, settling into her chair with the authority of someone who'd been making life-and-death decisions for decades. "Before we begin, I want to make something crystal clear. This is a court of law, not a television studio. Any disruptions, any grandstanding, any behavior that I deem inappropriate will result in immediate removal from my courtroom. Is that understood?" Her gaze swept across the packed gallery before settling on the lawyers' tables. "Now then, we're here for a motion hearing regarding the case of the state versus Evelyn Johnson. Counselors Morrison, you filed several motions that, frankly, I find ambitious." Hannah stood, her legal pad in hand. "Your Honor, we believe the evidence will show that Mrs. Johnson was wrongfully convicted based on circumstantial evidence, prosecutorial misconduct, and ineffective assistance of counsel." "Those are serious allegations," Judge Sterling said, her tone suggesting she'd heard similar claims 1,000 times before. "I hope you have more than emotional appeals to support them." "We do, Your Honor," Grace said, rising to join her sister. "We have new evidence that was never presented at trial, witness testimony that was ignored or suppressed, and documentation that calls into question the entire investigation." Whitman shot to his feet. "Your Honor, this is nothing more than a desperate attempt to relitigate a case that was thoroughly and fairly tried. The defendant was convicted by a jury of her peers after hearing all the evidence." "All the evidence that you chose to present," Hannah interrupted, earning a sharp look from Judge Sterling. "Ms. Morrison," the judge said coldly, "you will not interrupt opposing counsel in my courtroom. Mr. Whitman, continue." Whitman straightened his tie, clearly enjoying the rebuke. "As I was saying, Your Honor, this case was investigated thoroughly by our office and the police department. Mrs. Johnson had motive. She was in financial distress. She had opportunity. She lived next door to the victim. And she had means. The victim trusted her enough to let her into his home. What she had," Grace said when the judge nodded for her to respond, "was a relationship with Mr. Peterson that was based on genuine affection and mutual respect. She was helping care for an elderly man who had become like family to her and her daughters. The prosecution twisted that kindness into something sinister." "Kindness?" Whitman scoffed. "Is that what we're calling it when someone manipulates a vulnerable elderly man out of his life savings before killing him?" Hannah felt her professional composure slip for just a moment. "Mr. Peterson wasn't manipulated. He was." "He was what, Ms. Morrison?" Whitman's voice was sharp, predatory. "He was what to your mother? A convenient target? An easy mark?" The way he said mother made it sound like a dirty word, and Hannah saw red. But before she could respond, Grace placed a gentle hand on her arm. The same calming gesture Evelyn had used when they were children and their tempers got the better of them. "Your Honor," Grace said calmly, "Mr. Whitman seems more interested in character assassination than legal argument. Perhaps we could focus on the actual evidence." Judge Sterling nodded approvingly. "Indeed. Mr. Whitman, please confine your remarks to legal matters. Ms. Morrison, please present your first motion." Hannah took a deep breath, channeling every lesson Evelyn had taught them about grace under pressure. "Your Honor, our first motion concerns the suppression of evidence. Specifically, Mr. Peterson's personal journal, which documented his financial gifts to Mrs. Johnson and his reasons for making them. "The journal that was never found," Whitman said dismissively. "The journal that was removed from the crime scene before it could be properly catalogued," Grace corrected. "We have testimony from Mr. Peterson's neighbor, Mrs. Chun, who saw him writing in it regularly, and who specifically remembers seeing it on his kitchen table the day before his death." Judge Sterling leaned forward slightly. "And where is this journal now?" "That's what we intend to find out, Your Honor," Hannah said. "We believe it was deliberately suppressed because it would have exonerated our client." "Speculation," Whitman said. "Pure speculation without a shred of proof." "Then you won't mind if we investigate further," Grace said smoothly. "After all, if the journal doesn't exist or doesn't contain exonerating evidence, our investigation will only confirm Mrs. Johnson's guilt." For just a moment, Hannah saw something flicker in Whitman's eyes. Uncertainty, maybe even fear. It was gone in an instant, but it was enough to give her hope. "Your Honor," Whitman said, "this is nothing more than a fishing expedition designed to delay the inevitable. Mrs. Johnson was convicted fair and square, and these theatrical attempts to overturn that conviction are an insult to the victim's memory and to the jury that heard this case." Judge Sterling was quiet for a long moment. Her fingers steepled as she considered the arguments. Finally, she spoke. "I'm going to allow limited discovery on the journal issue," she said, ignoring Whitman's sharp intake of breath. "You have 2 weeks to produce evidence of its existence and contents. If you can't, we'll proceed with sentencing as scheduled." It wasn't everything they'd hoped for, but it was something. Hannah and Grace exchanged a quick glance. Their first small victory in what would be a long battle. "Thank you, Your Honor," Hannah said. As they gathered their papers, Whitman leaned over to their table, his voice low enough that only they could hear. "You girls are playing with fire," he said, his earlier charm completely gone. "Your mother is going to die for what she did, and when this circus is over, everyone will remember that you chose to defend a killer instead of seeking justice for an innocent old man." Grace looked up at him with the same steady gaze that had intimidated opposing counsel for years. "Mr. Whitman," she said quietly, "the only thing people will remember is that you tried to execute an innocent woman to further your political career. And when we prove that, and we will, your career will be over." Whitman's face went pale, but before he could respond, Judge Sterling's gavel came down. "Court is adjourned. 2 weeks, counselors. Don't waste them." As they walked out of the courthouse, past the still swarming reporters and curious onlookers, Hannah felt a familiar fire burning in her chest. They'd drawn first blood, but the real fight was just beginning. Have you ever had to stand up for someone you love when the whole world seemed against them? The threatening letter arrived at Hannah's law firm 3 days later, slipped under the door sometime during the night like a coward's whisper. Her secretary, Mrs. Patterson, found it when she opened the office that morning. A plain white envelope with no return address and Hannah's name typed across the front. "Drop the case or face the consequences." It read in block letters cut from magazines like something out of a bad movie. "Some sleeping dogs should stay buried." Hannah stared at the letter, her coffee growing cold in her hands. In 15 years of practicing law, she'd received her share of threats from disgruntled clients and opposing parties. But this felt different. More personal. More dangerous. Her phone buzzed with a text from Grace. "Got a present this morning. You too." "Yeah," Hannah typed back. "Coffee in an hour?" They met at their usual spot. A small cafe 3 blocks from the courthouse where they'd been meeting since law school to strategize and decompress. Grace was already there when Hannah arrived, her own threatening letter spread on the table between 2 untouched cups of coffee. "Identical," Grace said without preamble. "Same paper, same font, same amateur hour intimidation tactics." Hannah slid into the booth across from her sister, noting the dark circles under Grace's eyes. Neither of them had been sleeping well since taking on Evelyn's case. "Any idea who sent them?" "Could be anyone," Grace said, but her tone suggested she had suspicions. "Whitman's people, someone connected to the original investigation, Or just some racist asshole who doesn't like seeing two white women defend a black woman. Or, Hannah said quietly, someone who knows we're getting close to something they don't want us to find. Grace nodded grimly. Speaking of which, I have news. Good news and bad news. Bad news first. Always. The bad news is that Mrs. Chun, Peterson's neighbor who saw the journal, died yesterday. Heart attack in her sleep. Hannah felt her stomach drop. That's convenient timing. Very convenient. She was supposed to give us a formal statement this afternoon. Grace's voice was tight with controlled anger. The good news is that before she died, she called her daughter in California and told her everything she remembered about that journal, including some very specific details about what Peterson wrote in it. Hannah leaned forward. Such as the fact that he was giving Mama money not just for your college expenses, but because he was worried about his own nephew, Robert Peterson. Apparently, the nephew had been pressuring him for money, getting aggressive when the old man refused. Robert Peterson, Hannah repeated, pulling out her phone to make notes. Why wasn't he investigated? Because, Grace said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. According to the police report, he was cooperating fully with the investigation and had an airtight alibi. Want to guess who vouched for that alibi? Please tell me it wasn't Charles Whitman himself. Apparently, Robert Peterson is a major donor to Whitman's political campaigns. Has been for years. Hannah sat back in her chair, the pieces of a larger puzzle starting to come together. So Peterson's nephew needed money, had a history of pressuring his uncle, and just happened to have the future Attorney General as his personal character witness. Gets better, Grace said, pulling out a folder. I did some digging into Robert Peterson's finances. 3 days after his uncle's death, he made a cash deposit of $15,000, the exact amount that was supposedly stolen from the old man's house. Jesus, Hannah breathed. We need to. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. The caller ID showed Evelyn's number, but when Hannah answered, it wasn't her mother's voice on the other end. Ms. Morrison? This is Detective Ray Martinez with the County Sheriff's Department. I'm calling about your mother, Evelyn Johnson. Hannah's blood turned to ice. What about her? Is she hurt? She's fine, ma'am, but there's been an incident at the county jail. Someone tried to poison her food this morning. She's in the infirmary as a precaution, but she's asking for you and your sister. Grace was already standing, grabbing her purse and keys. We'll be right there, Hannah said, ending the call. The drive to the county jail was a blur of racing thoughts and mounting fear. Someone was escalating. First the threatening letters, then the convenient death of their key witness, and now a direct attempt on Evelyn's life. Detective Martinez met them at the jail entrance, a middle-aged Hispanic man with kind eyes and the weathered look of someone who'd seen too much in his career. Your mother is okay, he said immediately, seeing their faces. The kitchen staff noticed something wrong with her food before she ate much of it. Looks like someone mixed bleach into her oatmeal. Bleach. Grace's voice was sharp with horror. Enough to make her very sick, maybe kill her if she'd eaten the whole bowl. We're treating this as attempted murder, and we've moved her to protective custody. They followed Martinez through the maze of corridors to the infirmary, where Evelyn sat on a narrow bed looking smaller and more fragile than Hannah had ever seen her. But her eyes were alert, and when she saw her daughters, she managed a weak smile. My girls, she said, reaching out to take their hands. I'm all right, just a little queasy. Mama, Grace said, her voice thick with emotion. Who would do this? Who would try to hurt you? Evelyn shook her head. I don't know, baby, but I'm not surprised. There are people who want me dead, and they're getting desperate. Detective Martinez cleared his throat. Mrs. Johnson, I need to ask you some questions about the jail staff, other inmates, anyone who might have had access to your food. As Martinez questioned Evelyn, Hannah pulled Grace aside. This isn't random, she whispered. Someone knows we're getting close to the truth, and they're trying to silence her before we can prove her innocence. Or they're trying to scare us off the case, Grace replied. Make us think it's too dangerous to continue. Hannah looked at her sister, seeing her own determination reflected in Grace's eyes. Are you scared? Terrified, Grace admitted. But not enough to quit. Are you? Not even close. Detective Martinez finished his questioning and approached them. I'm going to be honest with you ladies. This jail isn't equipped for long-term protective custody, and whoever did this has connections inside. Your mother isn't safe here. What are our options? Hannah asked. We could transfer her to the state prison, but that comes with its own risks. Or, Martinez hesitated, glancing around to make sure they weren't overheard. There might be another way, but it would require some creative legal maneuvering. Grace raised an eyebrow. What kind of creative maneuvering? House arrest. If you could convince a judge that your mother poses no flight risk and that her life is in danger in custody, you might be able to get her released to your custody pending the appeal. Hannah felt a spark of hope. Judge Sterling would never agree to that. Maybe not, Martinez said. But there's another judge in the county who might be more sympathetic. Judge Patricia Williams. She's been critical of conditions in the county jail, and she's got a reputation for putting safety over politics. Judge Williams, Grace repeated, already pulling out her phone. I know her. She's tough but fair. If we can get an emergency hearing. I can help with that, Martinez said quietly. I've got some concerns about security here that I'd be willing to share with the court. Hannah looked at the detective with new respect. Why are you helping us? Martinez was quiet for a moment, his eyes distant. 20 years ago, I was a rookie cop who helped investigate a case where an innocent man was convicted of murder. By the time we figured out the truth, he'd already been executed. I swore I'd never let that happen again if I could help it. He handed Hannah his card. Your mother is innocent, isn't she? Yes, Hannah said without hesitation. Then let's make sure she lives long enough to prove it. As they prepared to leave the jail, Evelyn grabbed both her daughter's hands. Girls, I need you to promise me something. If this gets too dangerous, if they threaten you again, I want you to walk away. I won't have you risking your lives for me. Mama, Grace said firmly, we're not walking away. We're not leaving you. And we're going to prove your innocence if it's the last thing we do. That's what I'm afraid of, Evelyn whispered, but she squeezed their hands tightly, drawing strength from their unwavering loyalty. Outside the jail, as they walked to their cars, Hannah felt the weight of what they were up against settling on her shoulders. Someone powerful enough to orchestrate a murder conviction, silence witnesses, and attempt assassination was working against them. But they also had something their enemy didn't expect. The unbreakable bond of a family that had chosen each other against all odds, and the determination to fight for justice no matter the cost. The real battle was just beginning. Judge Patricia Williams' emergency courtroom was smaller than Sterling's, with warm wood paneling and windows that let in the late afternoon sunlight. She was a black woman in her 50s with natural hair streaked with silver and eyes that seemed to see straight through to the truth of things. This is highly unusual, Judge Williams said, reviewing the emergency motion Hannah had filed just hours earlier. House arrest for a convicted murderer pending appeal? You're asking me to take a significant risk, counselors. Hannah stood, her voice steady despite the exhaustion weighing on her shoulders. Your Honor, our client's life is in immediate danger. Someone attempted to poison her this morning, and the county jail cannot guarantee her safety. Detective Martinez, Judge Williams said, turning to the witness stand where the detective sat with his hands folded. Tell me about this alleged poisoning attempt. Martinez leaned forward, his voice grave. Your Honor, someone mixed industrial bleach into Mrs. Johnson's breakfast. If she had consumed the full portion, it likely would have killed her. We've launched a full investigation, but I have to be honest. Our jail has security issues that make protecting a high-profile inmate extremely difficult. District Attorney Whitman shot to his feet, his face flushed with anger. Your Honor, this is nothing more than a publicity stunt designed to generate sympathy for a convicted killer. There's no proof that this alleged poisoning was anything more than an accident. An accident? Grace's voice cut through the courtroom like a whip. Mr. Whitman, are you seriously suggesting that bleach accidentally found its way into our client's food? I'm suggesting, Whitman said coldly, that desperate lawyers will manufacture any crisis to advance their agenda. These women have turned this case into a media circus, and now they're trying to manipulate this court with unsubstantiated claims. Mr. Whitman, Judge Williams interrupted, her tone sharp, I've reviewed Detective Martinez's report. The lab results confirm the presence of sodium hypochlorite in the food sample. Unless you're suggesting the detective falsified evidence, I'd advise you to choose your words more carefully. Whitman's mouth snapped shut, but his eyes burned with fury as he glared at Hannah and Grace. Furthermore, Judge Williams continued, I'm troubled by the pattern of events surrounding this case. A key witness dies suddenly just before giving testimony. Threatening letters are sent to defense counsel, and now an attempt on the defendant's life. This court has a duty to ensure that justice is served, not that defendants are silenced before they can prove their innocence. Hannah felt a surge of hope, but she kept her expression neutral. Judge Williams was clearly sympathetic, but she was also careful. She wouldn't make a decision based on emotion alone. Your Honor, Grace said, we're not asking for Mrs. Johnson to be released without conditions. We're proposing house arrest with electronic monitoring, supervised by the court and with regular check-ins. She would be confined to her home with her daughters, who are both officers of this court and can guarantee her appearance at all proceedings. And what about flight risk? Judge Williams asked. Mrs. Johnson is facing execution. That's a powerful incentive to disappear. Hannah stepped forward. Your Honor, may I speak personally for a moment? Judge Williams nodded. Evelyn Johnson saved my life and my sister's life 19 years ago. We were 5 years old, abandoned, with nowhere to go and no one who wanted us. She took us in, raised us, sacrificed everything to give us opportunities she never had. She worked double shifts to pay for our education, stayed up all night helping us with homework, and loved us unconditionally when the world saw us as unwanted burdens. Hannah's voice grew stronger, more passionate. She didn't have to do any of that. She could have called social services and walked away. But she didn't, because that's not who she is. Evelyn Johnson doesn't abandon the people she loves, and she doesn't run from her problems. She faces them head-on with dignity and courage. The courtroom was completely silent, hanging on every word. She taught us that family isn't about blood, it's about choice. It's about showing up when things get hard, about fighting for what's right even when the odds are against you. She chose us when we had nothing to offer her but trouble and heartache. Now we're choosing her, and we're asking this court to give us the chance to prove what we know in our hearts, that she is innocent. Judge Williams was quiet for a long moment, her eyes moving between Hannah, Grace, and Evelyn, who sat at the defendant's table with tears streaming down her face. Mrs. Johnson, the judge said finally, please stand. Evelyn rose slowly, her hands shaking slightly as she faced the judge who held her fate in her hands. I've been on this bench for 12 years, Judge Williams said, and I've seen a lot of families torn apart by the justice system. But I've rarely seen the kind of loyalty and love that's been displayed in this courtroom today. Your daughters speak of you with a respect and devotion that can't be manufactured or faked. She paused, consulting her notes. However, I also have a duty to protect the community and ensure that justice is served. The charges against you are serious, and the jury that convicted you heard evidence that they found compelling. Hannah's heart sank, but Judge Williams wasn't finished. That said, I'm deeply troubled by the circumstances surrounding your incarceration and the apparent attempts to silence you and your counsel. The right to effective assistance of counsel is fundamental to our justice system, and that right is meaningless if defendants can be murdered before their appeals are heard. Judge Williams looked directly at Evelyn. Mrs. Johnson, I'm going to grant the motion for house arrest, but with strict conditions. You will be confined to your home at 1247 Maple Street under electronic monitoring. You will have no contact with anyone except your attorneys, immediate family, and court-approved medical personnel. Any violation of these conditions will result in your immediate return to custody. Do you understand? Yes, Your Honor, Evelyn whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Furthermore, Judge Williams continued, turning to Hannah and Grace, you two are personally responsible for your client's compliance with these conditions. If she violates them in any way, you will face sanctions that could include disbarment. Are you willing to accept that responsibility? Yes, Your Honor, they said in unison. Whitman was on his feet again, his face purple with rage. Your Honor, this is outrageous. You're releasing a convicted murderer into the community based on nothing more than emotional manipulation. Mr. Whitman, Judge Williams said, her voice like ice, you will not lecture me about the law in my own courtroom. If you have concerns about this decision, you're free to file an appeal. But I suggest you focus your energy on ensuring that your office can protect witnesses and maintain the integrity of the justice system. The rebuke hit Whitman like a physical blow, and he sank back into his chair, his political ambitions suddenly looking much less certain. Court is adjourned, Judge Williams said, bringing down her gavel. Mrs. Johnson, you'll be processed for release within the hour. Counselors, I expect regular reports on your client's status. As the courtroom began to empty, Hannah and Grace rushed to embrace their mother, who was crying openly now. Tears of relief, gratitude, and overwhelming love. My girls, Evelyn whispered, holding them tight. My beautiful, brilliant girls. I'm so proud of you. We're going to prove your innocence, Mama, Grace said fiercely. We're going to find the truth and make them pay for what they've done to you. I know you will, baby, Evelyn said, stroking Grace's hair the same way she had when Grace was 5 years old and afraid of thunderstorms. I know you will. Detective Martinez approached them, his expression serious but hopeful. Mrs. Johnson, I'll be coordinating with the monitoring company to get you set up at home. And I want you to know, I'm going to keep investigating this case. Someone tried to kill you today, and I'm going to find out who. As they prepared to leave the courthouse, Hannah felt something shift inside her. For the first time since taking on this case, she felt like they had a real chance. Not just because they'd won this battle, but because she'd seen something in Judge Williams' eyes. A recognition of the truth, a willingness to look beyond the surface and see the real story. Outside, the media was waiting, but Hannah barely noticed the cameras and shouted questions. All she could think about was getting her mother home, to the kitchen where she'd learned what love really meant, where she'd discovered that family was something you chose and fought for every single day. The system had failed Evelyn Johnson once, but it wouldn't fail her again. Not if Hannah and Grace had anything to say about it. The house on Maple Street had never felt more like a fortress. Electronic monitoring equipment hummed quietly in the corner of the living room, and Detective Martinez's patrol car made regular passes down the street. But inside, surrounded by legal documents and evidence boxes, Hannah and Grace worked with the focused intensity of surgeons performing life-saving surgery. It had been a week since Evelyn's release, and they'd made more progress than Hannah had dared hope. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, Robert Peterson's ex-wife, Linda, who'd been following the case in the news and finally decided to come forward. He was desperate for money, Linda had told them during a secret meeting at Grace's office. His gambling debts were out of control, and his uncle was the only family member with any real assets. When the old man started giving money to that black woman instead of him, Robert went crazy. She'd provided them with bank records, text messages, and most damning of all, a recording she'd made during one of Robert's drunken rants about taking care of the problem if his uncle didn't start acting right. But their biggest breakthrough came from an unlikely source, Mrs. Chen's daughter in California, who'd found something while cleaning out her mother's house. Mom was a pack rat, she'd explained over video call, holding up a small leather journal. She found this in Mr. Peterson's trash the day after he died. She was going to return it to the family, but then she heard about the trial and got scared. She kept it all these years, planning to do something with it, but the journal was everything they'd hoped for and more. Page after page of Peterson's careful handwriting, documenting his growing fear of his nephew, his decision to help Evelyn with her daughter's education, and most importantly, his plan to change his will to leave everything to charity instead of to Robert. The final entry, dated the day before his death, was chilling. Robert came by again today, angrier than I've ever seen him. He knows about the will change. I'm scared of what he might do. If something happens to me, I want people to know that Evelyn Johnson is a good woman who never asked me for anything. She's been like a daughter to me, and her girls are the grandchildren I never had. Armed with this evidence, Hannah and Grace had requested an emergency hearing with Judge Sterling to present their new findings. But Charles Whitman wasn't going down without a fight. The courthouse was packed again, but this time the energy felt different, expectant, electric, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. Hannah could feel the weight of everyone's attention as she and Grace took their places at the defense table, their mother sitting between them in the simple blue dress she'd worn to church for 20 years. Judge Sterling entered with her usual stern expression, but Hannah thought she detected something different in the older woman's demeanor. A wariness, perhaps, or maybe just the exhaustion of a judge who'd seen too many cases where the truth was more complicated than it first appeared. "We're here," Judge Sterling announced, "for an emergency motion to vacate the conviction in the case of the state versus Evelyn Johnson. Ms. Morrison, you claim to have new evidence that exonerates your client." Hannah stood, holding the journal like the precious artifact it was. "Yes, Your Honor. Evidence that not only proves Mrs. Johnson's innocence, but reveals the true identity of Mr. Peterson's killer." Whitman was on his feet immediately. "Your Honor, this is nothing more than another desperate attempt to relitigate a case that was fairly tried and decided. Whatever so-called evidence they claim to have is clearly fabricated." "Mr. Whitman," Judge Sterling said sharply, "you'll have your chance to respond. Ms. Morrison, proceed." Hannah approached the bench, her heart pounding but her voice steady. "Your Honor, I'd like to present 3 pieces of evidence. First, the personal journal of Harold Peterson, which documents his relationship with Mrs. Johnson and his growing fear of his nephew, Robert Peterson." She handed the journal to the judge, who began reading immediately, her expression growing more serious with each page. "Second," Grace said, standing to join her sister, "bank records showing that Robert Peterson deposited $15,000 in cash, the exact amount stolen from his uncle's home, 3 days after the murder. And third," Hannah continued, "a recorded conversation in which Robert Peterson admits to taking care of the problem if his uncle didn't comply with his demands for money." The courtroom erupted in murmurs, but Judge Sterling's gavel brought immediate silence. She continued reading the journal, her face growing paler with each entry. Whitman was frantically whispering with his assistants, his earlier confidence evaporating like morning mist. "Your Honor," he said, his voice strained, "even if this journal is authentic, which I seriously doubt, it doesn't prove anything. The defendant still had motive and opportunity." "Mr. Whitman," Judge Sterling interrupted, looking up from the journal, "according to this document, Mr. Peterson was planning to leave his entire estate to charity, not to Mrs. Johnson. That rather undermines your motive theory, doesn't it?" "The journal could be forged," Whitman said desperately. "There's no way to verify." "Actually there is," Grace said smoothly. "We've had the handwriting analyzed by 3 independent experts, all of whom confirm it's authentic. We've also had the paper and ink tested, both consistent with materials available in Mr. Peterson's home." Hannah could see the panic in Whitman's eyes now, the realization that his carefully constructed case was crumbling around him. But she wasn't finished. "Your Honor, there's something else. Something that goes to the heart of why an innocent woman was convicted of a crime she didn't commit." She turned to face the packed courtroom, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. "Robert Peterson is a major financial contributor to District Attorney Whitman's political campaigns. Has been for years. When Mr. Peterson was murdered, Mr. Whitman had a choice: investigate the victim's nephew, who had clear motive and opportunity, or focus on the black woman next door, who made an easier target for a prosecutor with political ambitions. The courtroom exploded into chaos, reporters shouting questions, spectators gasping, and Whitman's face turning purple with rage. "That's a lie," he shouted over the noise. "Your Honor, this is character assassination of the worst kind." "Is it a lie, Mr. Whitman?" Grace asked, pulling out a folder thick with documents. "Because we have campaign finance records showing that Robert Peterson has donated over $50,000 to your various campaigns over the past 5 years. We have phone records showing multiple calls between your office and Mr. Peterson in the days following his uncle's death. And we have witness statements indicating that you personally vouched for his alibi without conducting any meaningful investigation." Judge Sterling's gavel came down like thunder. "Order! Order in this court!" But the damage was done. Hannah could see it in the judge's face, in the shocked expressions of the spectators, in the way Whitman seemed to shrink into himself as the weight of his corruption became clear. "Mr. Whitman," Judge Sterling said, her voice deadly quiet, "I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I expect a direct answer. Did you have any contact with Robert Peterson regarding this case outside of official investigative channels?" Whitman's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. "Your Honor, that is, any conversations I may have had were in the interest of justice." "That's not what I asked," Judge Sterling said. "Did you or did you not have personal contact with a potential suspect in this case? A suspect who also happened to be a major contributor to your political campaigns?" The silence stretched out like a taut wire, and Hannah could feel the entire courtroom holding its breath. I may have spoken with Mr. Peterson," Whitman finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper, "but only to clarify certain aspects of his relationship with his uncle." "And during these conversations, did you inform Mr. Peterson that he was considered a suspect?" Another long pause. "I may have mentioned that we were looking at all possibilities." Judge Sterling's expression was thunderous. "Mr. Whitman, are you telling this court that you gave a potential murder suspect advance warning that he was under investigation?" The question hung in the air like an executioner's axe, and Hannah knew they had won. Not just the case, but something bigger. Justice for her mother, and accountability for a system that had failed so catastrophically. Whitman's career was over. Robert Peterson would finally face justice for his uncle's murder, and Evelyn Johnson would go home a free woman, vindicated at last. But as Hannah looked at her mother, sitting quietly with tears streaming down her face, she realized that the real victory wasn't in the courtroom at all. It was in the love that had brought them here, the family that had chosen each other against all odds, and the unbreakable bond that no corrupt prosecutor or unjust system could ever destroy. The truth had set them free, but love had given them the strength to fight for it. Judge Sterling's chambers had never felt so small. The mahogany walls seemed to close in as she sat behind her massive desk, the weight of 25 years on the bench pressing down on her shoulders like a physical burden. Across from her, Hannah and Grace sat with their mother between them, while Charles Whitman slumped in his chair like a man watching his world collapse in real time. "Mr. Whitman," Judge Sterling said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had just witnessed a complete breakdown of the justice system she'd devoted her life to serving. "I'm going to give you one opportunity to explain yourself, and I suggest you choose your words very carefully." Whitman's hands shook as he reached for his water glass. Gone was the polished politician, the ambitious prosecutor who'd built his career on high-profile convictions. In his place sat a broken man who'd gambled everything on a lie and lost. "Your Honor," he began, his voice hoarse, "I want to state for the record that I truly believed, that we had the right person. The evidence pointed to Mrs. Johnson, and I pursued the case in good faith." "Good faith?" Grace's voice cut through the chamber like a blade. "You call it good faith when you ignored evidence, suppressed witnesses, and protected the real killer because he funded your campaigns." "I never protected anyone," Whitman protested weakly. I made judgment calls based on the information available at the time." Hannah leaned forward, her voice deadly calm. "Mr. Whitman, We have phone records showing 17 calls between your office and Robert Peterson in the week following his uncle's death. We have bank records showing his campaign contributions. And we have witness testimony that you personally assured him he wasn't a suspect before any real investigation had taken place. How exactly do you explain that? Judge Sterling held up a hand before Whitman could respond. Actually, Mr. Whitman, don't answer that. Anything you say at this point could be used against you in the criminal proceedings that I'm certain will follow. She turned to her court reporter. Please note that I'm recommending this matter be referred to the State Attorney General's office for investigation of prosecutorial misconduct and possible criminal charges. Whitman's face went ashen. Your Honor, please. Please what, Mr. Whitman? Please ignore the fact that you nearly executed an innocent woman to protect a campaign donor? Please overlook the fact that you corrupted the very system you swore to uphold. The judge's voice rose with each word, years of judicial restraint finally giving way to righteous anger. In 30 years of practicing and presiding over law, I have never seen such a blatant perversion of justice. You have disgraced your office, betrayed the public trust, and very nearly caused the death of an innocent woman. She stood, her black robes billowing around her like the wings of an avenging angel. Mrs. Johnson, please stand. Evelyn rose slowly, her daughters flanking her like guardian angels in their barrister robes and wigs. For a moment, the three women stood together in perfect unity. A family forged not by blood but by love, tested by injustice but unbroken by adversity. Mrs. Evelyn Johnson, Judge Sterling said, her voice now gentle but carrying the weight of absolute authority. By the power vested in me by the state, I hereby vacate your conviction and order your immediate and unconditional release. The charges against you are dismissed with prejudice, meaning they can never be brought again. The words hit the chamber like a thunderclap. Evelyn's knees buckled, and only Hannah and Grace's quick reflexes kept her from falling. Tears streamed down all three women's faces as the reality of freedom, real, permanent freedom, finally sank in. Furthermore, Judge Sterling continued, I'm ordering an immediate investigation into the handling of this case, including the conduct of law enforcement, the prosecutor's office, and anyone else who may have contributed to this miscarriage of justice. She turned her attention back to Whitman, who sat frozen in his chair like a man watching his own execution. Mr. Whitman, you are hereby removed from this case and all related matters. I'm also recommending to the State Bar that disciplinary proceedings be initiated immediately. Your law license should be suspended pending a full investigation. Your Honor, Whitman said desperately, I have a family, a career. You should have thought of that before you decided to play politics with people's lives. Judge Sterling replied coldly. Mrs. Johnson has a family too, Mr. Whitman. 2 daughters who spent the last month fighting to save their mother from an execution she didn't deserve. 2 brilliant lawyers who put their own careers at risk to seek justice for the woman who raised them. She looked at Hannah and Grace with something approaching admiration. I've been on this bench for 25 years, and I've seen a lot of lawyers. But I've rarely seen the kind of dedication, skill, and courage you two have displayed. Your mother should be very proud. She is, Hannah said, her voice thick with emotion. And we're proud of her. She taught us that family isn't about blood. It's about showing up when it matters, fighting for what's right, and never giving up on the people you love. Judge Sterling nodded. Indeed. And speaking of family, there's one more matter to address. She picked up her phone and dialed a number. Detective Martinez? Yes, it's Judge Sterling. I need you to issue an arrest warrant for Robert Peterson immediately. Charges of murder in the first degree, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. Yes, I'll have the paperwork ready within the hour. She hung up and looked at the 3 women. Mr. Peterson is about to discover that justice delayed is not justice denied. He will face trial for his uncle's murder, and this time, the prosecution will be handled by attorneys who actually care about finding the truth. As they prepared to leave the judge's chambers, Whitman made one last desperate attempt to salvage something from the wreckage of his career. Your Honor, Please consider the broader implications of this decision. My office has successfully prosecuted hundreds of cases. And now every one of those cases will be reviewed, Judge Sterling said firmly. If you were willing to corrupt this case for political gain, how many others might be tainted? How many other innocent people might be sitting in prison because you cared more about your career than about justice? The question hung in the air like a death sentence for Whitman's legacy. He slumped back in his chair, finally understanding the full scope of what he'd lost. Outside the courthouse, the media circus was in full swing, but this time the energy was different. Instead of the predatory hunger for scandal, there was something approaching celebration. The rare story of justice prevailing, of truth triumphing over corruption, of love conquering hate. Hannah and Grace stood on either side of their mother as she addressed the crowd of reporters and supporters who had gathered. Evelyn's voice was soft but clear, carrying the dignity and grace that had sustained her through 19 years of raising 2 abandoned children and 3 years of wrongful imprisonment. I want to thank my daughters, she said, her eyes shining with pride and love, for never giving up on me, for fighting when I couldn't fight anymore, and for showing the world what family really means. I also want to thank Judge Sterling, Detective Martinez, and everyone who helped bring the truth to light. She paused, looking out at the crowd with the same gentle strength that had comforted 2 scared little girls so many years ago. But mostly, I want people to understand that this isn't just about me. This is about a system that failed, and about the importance of never stopping the fight for justice, no matter how impossible it seems. A reporter called out, "Mrs. Johnson, what's next for you and your family?" Evelyn smiled, the first truly joyful expression Hannah had seen on her mother's face in months. "We're going home. We're going to have dinner around our kitchen table, just like we used to when the girls were small. And we're going to remember that love is stronger than hate, that truth is more powerful than lies, and that family, real family, can survive anything." As they walked away from the courthouse, past the cameras and the crowds, Hannah felt a profound sense of completion. They'd saved their mother's life, exposed corruption, and brought a killer to justice. But more than that, they'd proven something that Evelyn had taught them long ago, that the bonds of love and loyalty are stronger than any force that tries to break them. The house on Maple Street had never looked more beautiful than it did that evening, bathed in the golden light of sunset. The electronic monitoring equipment was gone, the patrol cars had departed, and for the first time in months, the 3 women could simply be a family again. In the kitchen where it all began, where 2 abandoned little girls had learned what love really meant, Evelyn prepared dinner while Hannah and Grace sat at the same table where they'd done homework, shared dreams, and planned their futures. The conversation flowed easily, punctuated by laughter and the comfortable silences of people who knew each other completely. "You know," Evelyn said as she set plates of her famous fried chicken on the table, "I used to worry that I hadn't given you girls enough, that maybe you would have been better off with a real family, with more money, more opportunities." "Mama," Grace said firmly, "you gave us everything that mattered. You gave us love, values, and the strength to fight for what's right. What more could we have asked for?" Hannah nodded, reaching across the table to take her mother's hand. "You saved us, Mama. In every way that matters, you saved us. And today we got to return the favor." As they sat around that familiar table, sharing a meal in each other's company, Hannah realized that this was what victory really looked like. Not the courtroom drama or the media attention, but this, 3 women who had chosen to be family, who had fought for each other against impossible odds, and who had emerged stronger and more united than ever. Outside, the world continued to spin, full of injustice and corruption, and people who needed someone to fight for them. But inside the house on Maple Street, love had triumphed, truth had prevailed, and a family had proven that some bonds can never be broken. The system had failed Evelyn Johnson once, but love, fierce, unconditional, transformative love, had saved her in the end. And that love, Hannah thought, as she looked at her mother and sister, was the most powerful force in the world.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.